held to enable us to think through relational entanglements. So throughout history, islands have often been seen in this way as these kind of exemplary sites of relational entanglement. So that's one key reason why they rise to the fore in the development of contemporary Anthropocene work. So as we explain in the book, the contemporary debates about the Anthropocene islands are regularly invoked as having a different set of capacities, affordances and potentialities to modern or mainland life. The widely heralded capacity of islands to respond to the environment as shaped by relational agency is this key way of understanding why islands have become so central for so much contemporary Anthropocene thinking. They exemplify how all life is relationally entangled and codependent in the Anthropocene. So the relations of feedbacks associated with the Anthropocene are widely held to be kind of masked and hidden from a reductionist modern ontology or epistemology. But working with islands rises to the fore and plays this vital role in Anthropocene thinking, as it is precisely with islands that these relational effects are seen to come to the fore. So in a sense, that's setting up the kind of general stakes. As we move away from modernity as something that we kind of see as hubris, and we shift more towards the problematic of relational entanglements, the figure of the island and the islander that's long held to be kind of an exemplary figure of relational entanglements moves more to the center. In the past, islands were thought of as problematic for modernity. They were the outside of modernity because their relational entanglements made them weak and too sensitive to shifting environmental concerns. But as those become to the fore in the Anthropocene, it's precisely that interest in islands that rises to the surface. So to be clear, we're not saying that there is such a thing as island thinking in the book. There are, of course, only variations and ways of thinking about islands in different places over time. Under older European and modern thought, as I said, the island was often understood as insular, isolated, liminal or backward, even populated by savages when compared to continental mainland reading. But building directly on those over narratives, in debates about the climate change, we still see this idea that the island is backward and needs saving in many debates about rising sea levels. But in our book, Anthropocene Islands, Entangled Worlds, we want to update how the stakes have changed. We don't think that the island is just this figure that needs saving anymore in Anthropocene thinking. We think it's shifted from that narrative towards a generative and productive geographical form to engage with for the development of some of the key ways that are driving Anthropocene thinking, particularly in Western literature at the moment. So that's what we seek to do in the book, to draw that out. So our point, again, to stress the kind of what distinguishes this book, we're not saying that islands are symbolic figures for debates about the Anthropocene. They're not just symbols of global warming, rising sea levels, intensified hurricanes, nuclear fallout, and so on. What they are is generative figures for the different pathways and trajectories that Anthropocene thinking is taking. To be blunt, I'm a geographer and geography matters. We don't just develop Anthropocene thinking in our heads. What we do is we engage with the world and we are interested in geographical forms such as islands that are heralded to enable us to think through relational entanglements as the key problematic of Anthropocene thinking. So we go further than the kind of more usual point in the literature that islands are merely these symbols. We're not wanting to write about islands, we're wanting to think with islands after the end of the world of modern reasoning. More specifically, we're interested in the conceptual power of thinking with islandness. So this is perhaps the really pushing point of the book. Everything becomes a kind of island in the Anthropocene, because what we're interested in is the relational entanglements of everything, whether that's a snowflake, a car, or a geographical island, or islanders that are subjected to global warming. So we're interested in how these different pathways of thinking about islandness as a generative concept are playing out in broader Anthropocene thinking. Look. Apologies for that. So the purpose of the book, therefore, is to kind of conceptually clarify and draw out, for probably the first time in the literature, what we see as this key shift to thinking with islandness in a broad range of contemporary Anthropocene thinking and associated practices. Now, working with islands, the turn towards islandness as a generative concept for Anthropocene thinking clearly isn't taking place in the same way all over the world. It's not one homogeneous other to modernist or mainland approaches. So we want to start a conversation about the different ways in which islands are being brought into Anthropocene thinking for the generation of the different trajectories that Anthropocene thinking is taking place. So we see kind of this book as a kind of a start for a broader project called Anthropocene Islands, which has actually been going on for about a year now, and I'll talk about that at the end, but it's involving various reading groups and study groups in which people pull apart and think through the way in which islands have become generative for broader debates. In the book, we carve out kind of 4 tendencies or analytics that position the islands much more centrally within broader debates about the Anthropocene. Now, these are related to what we call relational ontologies and relational epistemologies or epistemologies. So the turn towards islands as generative figures is about how we can develop relational ways of thinking about being, relational ontologies, and relational ways of thinking about knowing. So in the first half of the book, we focus upon relational ways of thinking about being, relational ontologies, and we call those resilience and patchworks. In the second half of the book, we focus upon relational ways of thinking about knowing in the Anthropocene, relational epistemologies that we call correlation and storiation. And schematically, because it's a very schematic kind of book, they represent kind of different sides of the sliding scale. So at the one end of the relational ontologies, you have resilience, and that has more modern legacies, as we'll see in a minute, even as it kicks against modernity to some extent. And at the other hand, we have what's called patchworks. And the same is the case with the relational epistemologies. At the one end, you have correlation, which still has some modern legacies, and at the other have storiation, which pushes further and further away from those. So by the use of this conceptual sliding scale or continuum, we seek to illustrate how much Anthropocene thinking is extending its purchase and increasingly losing its modern constraints, both in terms of a shift from linear causality and universalism and away from the foundational grounding of the Kantian subject in terms of conceptions of linear time and flat space. What we do in the book, and I'll be able to just give a few examples in the talk, is we draw upon a huge range of literature which demonstrates just how much islands and islanders are cropping up in contemporary Anthropocene work, whether that's policy making, critical theory, and so on. Often in the background, but what we do is we seek to bring through why it would be that islands and islandness would become so central and just appear so often. We've got COP going on at Glasgow at the moment. Small island states are an absolutely key figures there, but they're also absolutely central figures for the development of critical theory today in the Anthropocene as well, or artistic practices, or activism, and so forth. So that's kind of what we want to do in the book. That sets up the stakes. Let's now turn to these different analytics, these 4 analytics that I was just talking about. The first are the relational ontologies, the relational ways of being that are being generated productively by thinking with islands. And the first relational ontology that we talk about in the book is that of resilience. So as just noted, the approaches to relational ontology that we examine are resilience and patchworks. And in the second chapter of the book, after we've outlined the stakes of the project, we focus upon resilience. Now, resilience is a term that you're probably very familiar with, and it's the analytic that has positioned islands and islanders most dramatically on the international stage. Resilience moves against the telos of linear progress and is about the dynamic, adaptive powers of interactive life. Resilience is everywhere. You know, my little girl, if she goes to school, she gets a little badge for being resilient. That they're cultivating resilient subjects. We want to cultivate resilient economies and so on. And obviously we want to cultivate resilience more generally in the world. This is a trope that's just dramatically risen to the fore. When I was younger, people didn't talk about resilience as a concept much at all. It's very central to the development of an interest in relational entanglements and how we can adapt and adjust in Anthropocene thinking more generally. So it moves against the telos of linear progress and is about these dynamic adaptive powers of interactive life. Now, much of the early work on resilience was developed on islands, as I'm sure many of you will know. The first question which C.S. Holling, who was one of the key figures in resilience thinking, asked the people who wanted to work on his programs. So if someone wanted to work with this kind of big figure in resilience thinking, the first question he said he asked them was, can you work on islands? Why islands? Well, because islands exemplify the properties of life that resilience is most interested in. As Darwin, who's a key figure in our resilience chapter, demonstrated, life itself, which he famously revealed on the Galapagos to the wider world through island life, doesn't tend towards a telos of linear progress, but speciation and differentiation is adaptive and non-linear. So resilience kicks off against modernity in that way. Yeah, it's about speciation, differentiation, and adaptation, relational entanglements, constantly adapting and adjusting. So Darwin's relational thought and understanding of life emerged, as we know, from thinking with islands as these radically alternative, different sites of investigation. For Darwin, evolution, differentiation, and the richness of life on islands, of speciation, revealed through thinking with islands as these kind of amplifying sites of relational entanglements, occurs through relations of codependency, and this makes island life appear more creative and adaptive. Now, of course, I'm not saying that resilience as a concept emerges from islands and it's only taking place on islands. What we are doing in the book is illustrating how work with islands, thinking with islandness and islanders has shifted from the periphery of international debate, mainly Western Anthropocene thinking, much more to the center, because with islands, it allows you to develop these kind of tropes. They're key figures for the developing of tropes like resilience. So Darwin was obsessed with the power of islands, of this island effect. Thus, with mockingbirds, these grey long-beaked birds differed from island to island, but so subtly that they seem to have diverged from one stock. Diverged, 3 kinds of mockingbirds, varying slightly this island to that. Yes, they appeared distinct but similar in a way that suggested relatedness. If that impression were true, Darwin confided to Henslow, who was his Cambridge biology professor, confessing an intellectual heresy, such facts would undermine the stability of the species. So it's well known that islands have inspired a large number of scientists to develop key ecological theories. And it's this power of islandness to reveal the adaptive codependency of life for Darwin that kind of catapults them onto the international stage as these key sites for resilience thinking more generally. And demonstrating this, the early or prototype post-human relational ontologies developed by Darwin blurred this divide between life and environment, pointing the way towards how all life on Earth can be characterized in terms of relational entanglements as interdependent, interactive, non-linear processes of becoming. So it's because of that kind of sense that islands are these kind of amplifying sites for interactive life, adaptive life, that today they emerge so centrally in international debates. Islands are often touted as being especially resilient. And with the kind of quotes you're seeing here, you'll be familiar with the vibe of these kinds of quotes. If we want to look to where resilient life is, arguably because of that longer history of thinking about islands and islanders as these adaptive forces, we turn to islanders, and there's just a couple of quotes there, but I could go on about many quotes that particularly turn to islands as sites for the development of resilience thinking. What we do in the book, however, is we're not just talking about kind of, I guess, more traditional ways of thinking about resilience in terms of ecological species or indigenous islanders. We also draw out how these kind of tropes are feeding through into very much contemporary imaginations of islands in terms of technologies as well. So here's one example here, which is from the Tallinn Architecture Biennial, in which Ecologic Studio designed an exhibition called Anthropocene Islands. And the whole point of this draws upon this imaginary of islands as these kind of dynamic sites of interactive dependency and interactive nonlinear becoming, to design a kind of technological island, which is seen as a resilient island by drawing upon kind of wastewater and producing technologies that produce a resilient island. I won't go too much into the detail of these things, because my point is just to draw out how islands are key sites for thinking through the problematic of relational entanglements, and that feeds through into different pathways or trajectories of Anthropocene thinking, such as, in this case, resilience. So we don't think it's useful to think of islands as kind of these blank spaces or test beds for importing external reasoning. Islands are often thought about in this way, laboratories, but that would suggest that it didn't matter what geographical form you kind of were thinking with, and geography does matter, yeah? Islands have long been thought of as these emblematic sites, as in Darwin, for relational entanglements and for adaptive thinking. So it does matter that the turn to islands enables us to develop contemporary thought. They're not these blank spaces. The geographies of the emblematic sites of relational entanglement matter. It's why so many people are turning to them for the development of Anthropocene thinking. Just to finish off on resilience before I turn to the next heuristic, the second heuristic of Patchworks, what's important to perhaps realize here is what I said earlier on. Even as resilience is a non-modern relational way of thinking about being, it still has these kind of modern legacies. So heuristically or analytically, resilience is an expression of working with islands, draws out how the resilient capacities of island life and islanders are part of spatial and temporally fixed assemblages with autonomous capacities for self-ordering and adaptation. So resilience thus traces and responds to relational entanglements, affordances, and feedback effects over a kind of still a linear time. There is still the Newtonian and Euclidean geometry playing through in the resilience imaginary of islands. Now, this is precisely why islands are seen as the kind of key figures of resilience that we can learn from and develop with. You can learn from an island's resilience capacities over space and time, which means that resilience still has these kind of modern flat notions of space and time. So having turned to that kind of first example of the key ways in which islands and islanders are being used for the generation of some of the broader key tropes of Anthropocene thinking, in this case, resilience. In the next chapter, we turn to what we call patchworks. Now, what we call patchworks, which we see as a kind of variation and development upon resilience thinking along that continuum or sliding scale, are also increasingly prevalent in Anthropocene thinking. Now, here we kind of tend to turn to the work of more experimental artists and activists and designers that see the Anthropocene as a condition in which we are all already in. So many of you may have heard of the work of, for example, Deborah Bird-Rose with Aborigines in Australia, or Anna Singh's engagement with Japanese islander practices, or Phil Hayward's work on Haida Gwaii, or Mimi Sheller's work on local Caribbean practices, and so forth. We talk about a lot of these examples in the book. The key thing about patchwork approaches compared to resilience, as I say, is that they shift debate much more obviously to how we're all already in the Anthropocene. Key is how patchwork approaches develop and disrupt the island ontology of resilience thinking, so that the modern imaginary of islands existing in this kind of flat two-dimensional space, side by side, tracing continuities in relation across a linear time, is replaced with a much more open island ontology of spatial and temporal becoming, working with the emergent disturbances and ongoing effects. So whilst that could be seen as kind of an expansion of a relational ontology, the key thing about patchwork approaches compared to resilience ones is that they're not solutionist. They destabilize the solutionist or instrumental approaches of resilience and are much more open and less governmentalizing and human-centered. So if resilience seeks to kind of instrumentally hold back transforming planetary change, then the work of patchwork ontologists and their engagement with islands foregrounds how entanglements are never fixed and thereby disrupt Euclidean notions of space and time compared to those of resilience. I'll give you some examples in a minute, but for patchwork ontologies, islands are not merely worlds that we are in, rather islands become ways of expressing and understanding our own processes of world making. As T.O. Ware famously says, islands become a verb, a practice of opening ourselves out and attuning to relational effects and knots of relational entanglements, rather than one of resilience, which tends to reify the world and suborn us to it. So in patchwork approaches, the focus is upon how we make and journey and explore, rather than merely reflect upon our relations in order to become more resilient. Whilst we could align patchwork approaches, therefore, with things like Western assemblage theory, or the work of Donna Haraway, Staying with the Trouble, what we want to emphasize is that the geographical form and cultures that are doing some of the most productive work in this are once again islands. As Haraway herself said, the Anthropocene first came into our consciousness by observing the changing relations around islands. So Patchworks isn't grasping relation, but focusing on the ongoing movements, emergences, and effects by thinking with islands and island cultures. So just as there's a longer history with Darwin that plays into how we think about resilience and the figure of the island in resilience thinking, there is also a longer tradition of thinking about islanders that plays through into patchwork approaches. So key for patchwork approaches, again, is this drawing upon a kind of deeper understanding of islands and islanders in particularly the Western psyche in disciplines like anthropology, where we have someone like Marilyn Strathern, who once described the Melanesian islanders in this particular way, as you see here. I'm not going to read out the quote, but the point is they are held to exemplify relational ways of being. They are not modern in the sense of a human nature divide. They are relational with everything around them on their island. And key here is that they are therefore non-modern and relational through and through. So Strathern, for example, compares the kind of Melanesian relational ways of being with Haraway's famous cyborg, saying that the distinction between the Melanesian islanders and Haraway's half human, half mechanical contraption is that the components of the Melanesian cyborg are conceptually cut from the same material. They are relational through and through. And what's key is the kind of creative act of severance, the burst of information that makes one person visible as an extended part of another. So again, just as Darwin drew upon, resilience thinking draws upon a kind of Darwinian understanding of island life, this kind of patchwork approach starts off with drawing upon a particular understanding of islanders as these relational beings, these relational figures. And what's key is how there's a creative act of severance in those relations that bursts forth. And we'll see that in some of the examples that we think are key for kind of patchwork approaches. One of the most famous critical theorists of the Anthropocene is Anna Singh, and we think she does exemplary kind of patchwork approaches, thinking with relationals, emergences and disturbances and effects, not in a kind of modern instrumentalist way, but as a way of kind of ongoing attunement to relations and disturbances and effects in her very famous book, The Mushroom at the End of the World. Now, she talks about the cultivation of the Satayoma traditional peasant landscapes, and in particular, the cultivation of the Matsutake mushroom. Now, in this quote here, we kind of get to grips with some of the key tropes of a kind of patchwork way of thinking with islands. It's this kind of ongoing disturbances and emergent effects and the delicate constant attuning to those relations, rather than the kind of clunky top-down modernist way of managing of kind of big large-scale agriculture in kind of the USA and continental thinking. So again, in this quote, what she's doing is comparing kind of the distinguishing practices of Satayama revitalization with those of the kind of clunky Western approaches of modern reasoning, where there's this clear human nature divide. And it's the kind, it doesn't mean that patchwork approaches aren't intensive. It's about the ongoing delicate attuning of relations. So she's sort of drawing upon here the way in which you can think about a kind of patchwork approach that allows us to think about how we consider landscapes more generally as products of unintentional design. That is the overlapping and world-making activities of many agents, human and non-human, and the design isn't kind of clear, and it's not a planned effect, but humans and non-humans join each other in a kind of unintentional design. So again, in the patchwork approaches, I'll just end this because it kind of distinguishes Singh's approach quite nicely. Humans were not part of the forest assemblages in the Matsutake management in the United States and China that she was influenced in. Managed their leap to anxieties about too much disturbance, not too little. In contrast to Satayama work, forestry elsewhere was measured on the yardstick of rational advancements. Could the forest make futures of scientific industrial productivity? In distinction, a Japanese Satayama aims for a livable here and now. So what we're kind of talking about here is a kind of approach that kind of heuristically or analytically is similar to the idea of a kind of Japanese gardens, which again first appeared on the island of Honshu around 600 AD, where Buddhists developed a new style of gardening by working with care and intensively to constantly attune to disturbances and emergent effects, rather than kind of preset plan. That's what a patchwork approach is. It's quite different to resilience approaches in the sense it's about working with the disturbances and emergencies of relational effects, illustrated by this patchwork thinking with islands, rather than terms of bounded spaces of human control and self-regulating harmony of a resilience approach. It's central for tuning kind of work with islands and islanders to the condition of the Anthropocene. So thinking with islands is really key for the development of broader Anthropocene thinking. We've talked about resilience and we've talked about patchworks. Now, Singh doesn't really talk so much about islands in her book, but they are everywhere. And we don't think it's any coincidence at all that these kind of key figures of relational entanglements in the Anthropocene, the island, are taking place on these Japanese islands. And also, if you think about the way in which the Buddhist gardeners cultivated their practices on Honshu, it's an islanding. Now, key here is a way in which we can think about patchwork approaches in terms of making islanding a verb. It's a way of worlding. It's a way of thinking through the emergent disturbances and the relational entanglements of islands in the Anthropocene as an ongoing process of world making. And here we have Teresa Teowea's famous quote about how we should make islands a verb, not a noun. They're not graspable spaces in the sense of modern reasoning. It's about ongoing movements and relational becoming in this kind of patchwork approach. And again, the figure of the island, once you start looking at Anthropocene thinking and poetry and art and policy making, You just see it everywhere. Arguably one of the leading poets of the Anthropocene, Juliana Spahr, writes about Hawaii, and in a kind of own inimitable style, she slows down her pulse in order to breathe into consciousness, amplify and attune to the vastness of island relation becoming in her own rhythmic style of writing, which I will not read, but I will leave there for you to kind of think through. And it's this kind of ongoing attuning to relational movements and open spatial and temporal becoming. So I guess the kind of argument here, just finishing off the kind of patchworks and the relational ontologies, is that we think it matters that the island has shifted so far from the periphery to the center of international debate, particularly in Western debates, in Anthropocene thinking. In so many examples we discuss in the book, islands emerge as these key sites for relational and temporal becoming, processes of welding and attuning to relational entanglements and feedbacks that are in distinction from resilience. They're not instrumental in the way of resilience. They're not these systems approaches, these flatter approaches where you can kind of just replicate resilience approaches across space and time, but ongoing process of movements and attuning to relation in terms of the Anthropocene as a condition in which we're all already in. So that's the relational ontologies, the relational ways of thinking about being with islands that are emerging in broader contemporary Anthropocene thinking. We choose two examples, those of resilience and patchworks, but in the broader Anthropocene Islands project, people are starting to draw out many others beside. In the book, as I say, we just draw out 4 analytics: resilience, patchworks, correlation, and storiation. Correlation and storiation are relational onto-epistemologies or epistemologies. They are relational ways of thinking about knowing. How do we register the Anthropocene? And again, we see the figure of the island and islander shifting from the periphery more towards the center of these debates, precisely because islands are held to be these emblematic figures of thinking through relational entanglements. So turning to relational epistemologies, in the second half of the book, we turn to how islands' work is productive of distinctive relational approaches to epistemology, those of onto-epistemology. In a kind of turn towards relational ontologies, questions of knowing can't be separated entirely from being. They are onto-epistemological. Knowing isn't doesn't emerge from just passive reflection. It's understood as a reflection of being itself. So in the second half of the book, we seek to suggest that work with islands is being profoundly generative of how we come to know the Anthropocene, to register it through these tropes of correlation and storiation. And in this sense, just as resilience can be seen as a kind of more modern legacies playing through in resilience, and patchworks is less modern, the same goes for correlation and storiation. Correlation has these more modern legacies, and storiation seeks to disrupt those much, much more. So turning to correlation, what correlation approaches do is they still maintain the idea of a knowing subject and a world of patterned regularity amenable to policy intervention. So here again, the island emerges as a key correlational technology, a way in which we can register and understand and know the Anthropocene. The island is the emblematic canary in the coal mine, where changes in islands are often seen as the first signs or indicators of kind of looming climate change and disasters. Islands kind of are seen as these registers of what is going on in the broader world. As Elizabeth de Loffre says, the island is understood not just as the Earth, but its anticipated future. Central for us, however, isn't the fact that islands are vulnerable or exposed, but rather this kind of correlational logic that's in play in seeing or perceiving something through changes in an other entity, the epistemology of interrelation and correlation, rather than just linear cause and effect. So in this sense, climate change doesn't cause island changes, it manifests as, or in fact is, changes. So in onto-epistemological framings, we move from a temporal and spatial line of movement to one of synchronicity, which enables humans to better read and sense transforming planetary conditions. So in the work on correlation, we draw out widely how islands are these canaries in the coal mine. They are these key figures, islands and islanders, for sensing and correlating and reading and registering changing planetary conditions. The turn to indigenous islanders, sensing abilities. The turn to the evolutionary pathways of island life as ways of sensing the changing conditions of the Anthropocene, but also the massive interest in the development of smart islands and sensor technologies on islands like Singapore for sensing and correlating and registering transforming planetary change. So this just kind of says what I've already said, but it kind of just makes the point more forcefully, perhaps. Islands are often seen at the planetary front line of environmental change. They're these finely tuned, sensitive places, these barometers of the Earth, the litmus test for what's going to happen elsewhere. Here we see kind of the work of people like Tom Van Doren and his Flightways, an excellent text, where he talks about how the actual evolutionary pathways of species are not an empty trajectory, but they embody a particular way of life. So thus correlatory, if as species change and die out and evolve in different ways, looking at species is a way in which we can register and correlate and sense the changing conditions of the Anthropocene. Now, Van Doren, who's a leading Anthropocene critical scholar, has started up the project called The Living Archive, in Extinction Stories from Oceania. Now, I would argue that the reason he's turning to Oceania is precisely because islands have long been held as these emblematic sites, these sensitive sites of adaptation and interrelation that enable us to now sense through the evolutionary pathways of their different species, the changing conditions of the Anthropocene. They allow us to register the Anthropocene, to reveal the Anthropocene to us. Now, of course, it's not just evolutionary pathways and the biology of the non-human biology of island life that is seen as this correlational machine that allows us to register the Anthropocene. It's also indigenous islanders themselves, the humans that live on the islands. Yeah. As we see here from Kassinger and Todd, Western critical scholarship is really worried about itself. It's worried about its modern frameworks of reasoning that kind of separate out ontology and epistemology, knowing from being in that kind of modern clunky way. And it therefore turns to indigenous islanders that are seen to kind of have a conception of onto-epistemology. Their very being and living is a way of registering and correlating to the environment. So I'm not going to read these quotes. As in the resilience one, there are just hundreds and hundreds of quotes which you can pull out, where you see that the islander, the figure of the indigenous islander, emerges as this kind of sensitive sensing machine that allows us to register and read transforming planetary change. Again, the simple point, islands and islanders have shifted from the periphery towards the center of international debates about the Anthropocene, precisely because they are seen as these kind of emblematic figures for working through the problematic of modern framework of reasoning, the human nature divide, and the sensitivities towards relational entanglements. That isn't, of course, just taking place in relation to the biology of islands and indigenous islanders. There is also a massive interest, because of this long history in islands as sensitive sites of relational entanglements, in the development of smart island technologies in the contemporary era. This interested in the kind of producing of sensors on islands that allow us to correlate and read constantly the way in which the climate is adapting and changing. So the final heuristic I want to turn to is that of storiation. So far, we've worked through resilience with its kind of still modern legacies that drew upon island life as this kind of emblematic figure of adaptation and interrelation. Then we turn to patchworks, which is a more spatial and temporal process of ongoing becoming, of disturbances and emergent effects. For the patchwork thinkers like Singh, the Anthropocene is a condition we're already in. We can't hold it back or solve it or bounce back within it. We have to kind of move and stay with the trouble, as Donna Haraway would say. Then we're turning now to the epistemologies of correlation and finally storiation. These are ways in which people work with islands to register the Anthropocene as a condition. Now, correlation, even though it turns to things like indigenous islanders, still is a bit modern, because the sense is that in a correlation or a sensing approach, there's still a human subject able to read what's going on. So we can stand back and we can look at the evolutionary pathways of a particular island species, see it changing, and that allows us to register things. We can use sensing technologies on islands, and we can read them. In the ontology, in the epistemology of storiation, which is the final one in the book, things get a bit more weird. In storiation, it more profoundly disrupts the modern binaries of subject, object, thought, being, and the focus upon interrelations to a much greater extent than the logics of correlation. Instead, in storiation approaches, they turn to islands and island cultures and thinking with islandness as key emblematic holding sites for generating knowledge of the effects, traces, and afterlives of modernity and colonialism by way of more speculative approaches and practices. So in these kind of debates, they turn to kind of examples like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch or plastic washing up on island shores, or the embodied movements of islanders existing within the ongoing legacies of colonialism. Islands as these holding spaces for registering global warming, nuclear test out and fallout. But they don't seek to register all that in the way of correlation. They're not talking about patterned regularity. The island itself becomes a register in terms of intra-relation rather than a graspable interrelation. You can't stand back and read the island or the islander in a kind of modern way. And therefore, the force of the island or the islander in storiation is about disrupting modern frameworks of reasoning and replacing the kind of more speculative approaches that aren't about grasping, and we'll see that in some of the examples. Storiation approaches tend to register the effects of modernity and colonialism in kind of more weird, ghostly, haunting, and embodied movements, and sometimes in quantum ways. Now, I'm not going to go into huge details in the presentation. So here we can just kind of flag up the work of someone like Timothy Morton, who's been called the Anthropocene prophet or the prophetess for the Anthropocene, and his work with islands, where he talks about how the impassable rift opens up in islands between islands in their total relations, which we simply can't grasp, the ontological reality, we cannot grasp all the relations, and the capacity of humans to register that totality, or the work of Karen Barad on the quantum, nuclear testing and fallout, or the work of Christina Sharp and Tiffany King on how Black life registers and holds the legacies of colonialism. Now, these are quite different authors, so clearly we're not saying they're all the same, but what we're doing is we're drawing out a cross-cutting analytic here of storiation and saying how that can be drawn out. In these debates, islands and island cultures in particular are regularly employed to highlight how there is no away or past in the Anthropocene, exemplified by how when it comes to such vast multidimensional forces of global warming, there's no isolated island cut off over there. All islands are already within global warming. Some of the forces of global warming play out more immediately in the intensified hurricanes hitting islands around the world every year. Others stretch out for hundreds of thousands of years in how long it takes for carbon to dissolve in the oceans around islands. So thus working with islands, we come to see the world as one of strange attractors. Islands become these holding forces of interconnections, rather than one of clear separations, linear causality, or branching trees. So let's get into some of the examples of this to perhaps make it clearer. A good example of a historiation approach is a book that's got a lot of interest lately, and that's David Farrier's Footprints in Search of Fossil Futures. Now, this opens with a famous example of Friday's footprints on the island in Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Just read it here. It happened one day about noon going towards my boat. I was exceedingly surprised with the print of a man's naked foot on the shore, which was very plain to see in the stand. I stood like one thunderstruck, or as I'd seen an apparition. I listened, looked around me. I could hear nothing, nor see anything. There was exactly the very print of a foot, toes, heel, and every part of a foot. How it came thither, I knew not, nor in the least imagine. What's important here for the approach of storiation is the message that Farrier, as an Anthropocene thinker, takes home from this. What he says is that example illustrates the point that after enduring the solitude on his desert island, he suddenly sees hints of human presence everywhere, mistaking every bush and tree, fancying every stump at a distance to be a man. The discoveries of Friday's footprints and the footprints of early humans have such a vivid claim on our imagination because we've all lived a version of it at some point. The sudden feeling of being accompanied by an unseen other. Although you are alone, the air seems somehow closer, or an empty room is still thick with the presence of one just departed. Someone or something has passed through already. So what Farrier is doing in this work, in this kind of storiating approach, is it's illustrative of the sense that everything is already in the Anthropocene. The legacies, the presence of human presence is everywhere. And we can register this on the island. The islands become these holding sites, but they're not stories in which you could grasp that in a modern way or a correlational way. They're these holding sites for our speculative reflection upon the human presence that has transformed the planet through the condition of the Anthropocene. And here we see another example from Farrier in which he talks about Singapore's super trees. The super trees as the kind of emblematic figures of modernity in the Anthropocene, these kind of modern super trees on Singapore, are actually not a celebration of modernity for Farrier at all. They're these holding spaces which allow us to kind of hold and register the ongoing forces of the Anthropocene. So again, you see in that quote, different reflections of human inflicted time flow through the scene. The panoply of products entombed in the containers, in the patina of carbon residue from the forest fires in neighboring Borneo that might find its way into an ice core thousands of miles away, or in the soundless crashing of tropical diversity. The skies are clear, but in recent years, for much of June through October, the island has been enveloped in a thick smog, blown from illegal and uncontrolled fires, used to clear Indonesian rainforests and make way for giant palm oil plantations. The Garden City is a node in a vast network of extraction and consumption, linked to countless shadow places across the planet. So, as I say, that's a nice illustration of the way in which storiation doesn't seek to kind of register the forces of the Anthropocene in the way of correlation. There's not kind of a patterned regularity. We're not looking for indigenous sensing capabilities or smart set technologies. The island becomes just this holding force, which we can't grasp, but just registers everywhere the ongoing legacies of human pollution, development and progress. Now, just to end this analytic of storiation before I conclude this talk, what I want to emphasize here again is the figure of the island. The figure of the island emerges everywhere in contemporary Anthropocene thinking, and it therefore would be inevitable that we would be turning more and more to older Anthropocene scholars and writers. The power of thinking with islands and island cultures in the development of contemporary storiation approaches has involved a significant turn to older writers. So Camus Brathwaite, very famous writer from the Caribbean, has been particularly influential for what we think is the development of this analytic. When Brathwaite informs us about the Caribbean woman that he sees on the beach sweeping the sand, he understands again that colonialism is held in her embodied interactions, in our Nana's action, like the movement of the ocean she's walking on, coming from one continent continuum, touching another, and then receding, reading from the islands into the perhaps creative chaos of their future. What's at stake in Brathwaite's storiation then is the working through of intra rather than interrelation. Colonialism and the island condition is registered as her embodied movements as she sweeps. Brathwaite famously employs the term dialectic to describe this islander psyche, which is a product of colonialism and the island condition. And he goes to great lengths to distinguish what he's doing, which is registering her embodied movements as holding the legacies of colonialism, from the European storyteller who tells a story about, for example, that lady on the beach. Brathwaite's isn't a story about an islander, it's a storiation that seeks to think with and from her islander life and embodied movements. So as he says, the meaning of the Caribbean was in that humble, repetitive ritual action which this peasant woman was performing. And she was always on this journey, walking on the steps of sunlit water, coming out from a continent we didn't fully understand, to a set of islands which we are now only barely coming to respect, cherish, and understand. So Brathwaite's approach helps us think through the ontopistemology of storiation, an analytic which we read is important to many contemporary Black study scholars. For example, Christina Sharp, whose work focuses upon Black lives lived in the wake of colonialism, holding together the past and the present together. Sharp's highly influential book, In the Wake, engages Brathwaite as a key figure for registering the haunting traces and legacies of colonialism interrelationally. Sharp quotes Brathwaite's Dream Haiti about contemporary Haitian refugees at Slee. The sea was like a slate grey of what was left on my body and the white waves. I remember. For Sharp, as for Elizabeth de Loffre, Brathwaite's material registration is a powerful depiction of the collapse of space and time, separating the contemporary interdiction of Haitian refugees at sea and the long history of patrolling African bodies in the Middle Passage. There's no way, the past isn't over in these debates. Just as for Farrier, the past and the present and the vast nature of relations come through the island and we sense it and hold it everywhere. It's the same in this example of Haitian refugees. That is registered interrelationally through the bodies of those refugees as holding sites. So as I say, the past is not over, as in the linear temporalities of modernity, but it's constitutive of the islander present. For Sharp, we must reject modern frameworks of reasoning as a way of understanding or grasping these bodies. They should instead be registered or known onto-epistemologically as holding spaces for speculative possibilities. Sharp is explicit on the matter. Her understanding is that for Brathwaite, as for the recent work of people like Fred Moten, the inability to register Black bodies by way of modern frameworks of reasoning is a testament to the fact that objects can and do resist the grasping hand of modernity. And it's this, for Sharp, which needs to be registered, this storiation. These are questions of temporality, the longue durée, the residence and hold time in the wake. At stake then is to stay in the wake towards inhabiting a blackened consciousness that would rupture the structural silences produced and facilitated by, and that produce and facilitate Black social and physical death. So that wraps up the epistemologies, the relational epistemologies that we are interested in exploring. Both correlation and storiation are situated approaches, they're material and relational. Where they differ is that when I was talking about the correlation approaches, it's the patterned regularity of interrelational effects which is key, as adaptive interactive life correlates in ways which are amenable to facilitate human understanding and prediction. The changing evolutionary pathways of islands are there for us to register the changing conditions of the Anthropocene. Indigenous islanders, in a sense, are there for us Their sensing abilities allow us to better attune to the shifting states of changing environmental conditions. So there is still, in a sense, a rather modernist approach to correlation, a one-world modelist conception of time and space. They are seen as replicable models. You can develop sensing technologies, turn to indigenous islanders, develop smart sensors on islands, and they can be replicated and read the Anthropocene all over the world. Finally, in the storiation approaches, what I talked about, there's this much more problematic approach to modern notions of linear time and space. Whether we're talking about Farrow's work or Christina Sharp's work or Brathwaite's work, they're speaking of this irreducible embodied intrarelations, where the afterlives of effects register through island and islander life. There is no away in the Anthropocene. There is no past in the Anthropocene. All are registered, and the haunting legacies are registered, but cannot be grasped by modern reasoning in islands and islanders. So I've said a lot there. It's probably one of the longest talks I've ever given. When we do this stuff, Dave and I normally just chat. But I thought for this audience, I don't really know many of you, and I wanted to give you a really long and detailed talk of what the book does. It gives us time for questions, but I'm just going to kind of summarize the stakes of what I've said just one more time. Relational entanglements has emerged as the central problematic of the Anthropocene. There's a waning faith in modern frameworks of reasoning within the West. Yeah, we're largely talking about Western critical theory and how it turns to islands and islanders. With that, it would be inevitable that Western critical theory, policymaking and practice would turn to geographical forms that enable us to think through relational entanglements. Now here, we don't think that islands are mere symbols of the Anthropocene. Hopefully, as I've demonstrated, they are productive and generative for different pathways of relational thinking in the Anthropocene. Relational ways of thinking about being in resilience and patchworks, and relational ways of thinking about knowing in correlation and storiation. And what we're trying to do with this, the book Anthropocene Islands, Entangled Worlds, is kickstart this debate. Islands are not these blank spaces anymore in Western modern thought. They are productive and generative spaces. And we're interested in exploring and teasing out how and why that may be the case. So I think I'll stop there and we can be open for questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Jonathan Pugh, for your very rich and thought-provoking presentation of your research with Professor David Chandler. Professor Jonathan, I've got here some questions, although I will also open the floor to the audience. For my first question, the first question sent by one of the audience, what forms of relationships are taking place in the islands that you discussed, and what do you think is the function of these islands in forming such relationship?
Sorry, you cut out. Would you please say that again?
I'm very sorry. Okay, the first question sent by the audience is that what forms of relationships are taking place in these islands, and what is the function of these islands in forming such relationships?
So for the project of the book, what we're interested in doing is teasing out the ways in which islands are being worked with and drawn upon for the development of broader thinking. So the relationships we're interested in are precisely those that enable islands to be seen as generative for broader developments like the four I outlined, like resilience, patchworks, correlation and storiation. When we use those analytics, they're just ways in which we're kind of seeking to kind of capture and draw out broader trends in Anthropocene thinking, as I say, largely in Western Anthropocene thinking. So the relationships are those that enable islands to be seen as generative, not just for walking around the island and thinking about islands, but actually for broader ways of thinking about and engaging in the world in Anthropocene thinking, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Another question, maybe you and Professor David can answer this one. What can you say about the idea of resilience, since there's a discussion of resilience in the book? What can you say about the idea of resilience being co-opted or abused by policymakers or politicians, that they usually highlight or advertise the resiliency as a virtue of these groups of people, instead of putting reforms or services that can improve the quality of life of the people living in the islands?
Well, my voice is now pretty much going, so I'm going to hand over to David, I think, for that one. Talk to that one.
Thank you,
Is that
Professor. Okay, Professor David, you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. I couldn't unmute myself before. So yes, so a question about resilience and how these discourses of responding and relating to issues in a sort of continual way of work on yourself and a sensitivity to the environment and a reflective awareness of your choice making. Clearly there's possibilities of, well, I mean, that's what resilience is about, isn't it? It's a way of governing and a way of thinking rather than like a one-off decision. It's a sort of way of working with the world in relation. So it's an iterative, continual process of adapting. Whether you would say that can be co-opted for good reasons or bad reasons, I'm sure that there's like a division around that. It's just a different approach. It's a sort of shift away from a world where there's a problem and we apply a solution and the problem goes away, in a sort of more relational ontology, a bit like the Anthropocene or something like that. You know, you build a wall against flooding, but that doesn't mean you've solved the problem or the problem has gone away, because the problem is a sort of relational one of modern industrialized processes and their impact on the environment. Then sort of the flooding comes back. And so it's that sort of way of thinking that, as John was saying towards the end, that things don't really go away, that we're sort of stuck with things. And clearly you can read it like a conservative aspect to that, that there is no longer a telos of progress as we cut ourselves away from the world and separate ourselves from problems and resign them to the past. But for many people, that's actually the reality of the world that we live in. And therefore, these resilience relational understandings make a lot of sense, or can even be understood as like radical and critical and empowering of communities and distributive of power and agency. And therefore, you know, on the side of a sort of progress, once we sort of realize that the context in which we're working and having these discussions is a slightly different one.
Okay. Thank you, Professor David, for addressing the question. Another question here before I open the floor. Here's the statement. Anthropocene is quite new to me, but your use of the word resilience caught my attention. Probably not in the matter you intended it to. In the Philippines, the word is popularly understood as a general attitude of being able to survive multiple natural disasters, such as tropical storms. While there are instances of being adaptive in the sense of people being more receptive to government interventions, such as forced evacuations, there is also a belief that the concept of resilience makes the Philippines more complacent. Complacent in the sense that long-standing interventions, such as improving our infrastructure's capability to withstand disasters, is not undertaken. There are even those who criticize the tendency to romanticize, if not sexify, resilience. May we know what are your thoughts on this, especially in relation to anthropogenic agency? Hello, hello.
Hi, it's very well regulated, isn't it? You have to ask permission. And all the questions go through someone else. So another question on resilience, and I'm not really exactly sure how this question differs from the previous question. you're sort of saying about there's a romanticization in the Anthropocene where we sort of understand that it's nice to be in touch with others and other species and in a relation with our problems because we realize that we're partly to blame for those problems. Then maybe there's a romanticization of resilience as a set of attributes, that it's not just exotic people who live in exotic islands that have this relationship with the world, that we can romanticize our own embeddedness in the world. When we wake up and it's raining outside, we think, yeah, you know, a little bit of that is me. If I hadn't used my car yesterday, maybe there wouldn't be this warming and this climate. And you can sort of feel that you're in the world, although you're in the world in a sort of bad and problematic way. The fact that you can sense a certain responsibility and a certain connection, maybe you would see that as positive. And I think that the points that John was drawing to towards the end of the session around storiation, I think he was drawing out the inability to make cuts and divisions, that we can't really separate the present from the past, or the present from the future, or us from the weather. That's a sort of like an erasure in a way of the world that used to exist. So some people see the Anthropocene as the end of the world, literally, very importantly, with species extinction and sea level rise. But for other people, and I think what the book is really sort of getting at in a conceptual way, is the end of the world ontologically, the inability to make cuts and to make separations, which is sort of what we begin to see in an island world, because islands were really started us off on this understanding of how important relations are and interactions, rather than things that had separate trajectories. That sort of world of mixing and us disappearing into that mix. So I'm going to mute myself. I can do that on my own, can't I?
Okay. In the interest of time, I can only entertain one more question from the audience. Please raise your hand. Yes, Billie Jean, please open your microphone. Thank you.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Thank you. So, the idea of resilience, as described earlier, is the value of it is that the island sensing, we can sense the changes in the Anthropocene through what survived in the islands that we have observed. However, in Darwin's natural selection, there is a prominent element of survival of the fittest, in which only the fittest survive and the unfit does not. So there's an assumption of inherent diversity in the world, and a lot of diversities or varieties do not survive. So this means that, like, the idea of resilience thinking in the perspective of world making is that of world limiting, because it selects out the unfit traits through extinction. I think my question would be that, since vulnerability to changes brings islands closer to the center, is it possible that extinction thinking rather than resilience thinking will bring the islands closer to the center than resilience thinking does? Or is it the exact same perspective?
Please enable our guest speakers to unmute their microphones. Team. Okay.
Hey, thank you for letting me unmute myself. So I like that idea. That's I'm not really sure exactly how extinction thinking works, but I get the idea that what you're saying about the survival of the fittest, that it doesn't seem to be too problematic, the sort of rate of extinction and the closure of future possibilities in the sort of crisis that we call that Anthropocene, that maybe it's a sort of slightly positive outcome, that we're just, in a sort of competitive market way. But I think the first point that I'd like to say about the survival of the fittest is that there's different ways of understanding what it means to be the fit ist. And I think that in a Darwinian way, we can think about fitting in as in sort of sensitive to our context and our relations. So the survival of the fittest as in an ability to be fit for purpose, which is continually changing and continually in relation, is slightly different from a highly linear understanding of survival of the fittest, as in the strongest and the biggest and the most brutal and the meanest. That's like the first point that I'd want to make. And so extinction thinking may not be that different from a survival of the fittest, because without being fit as in sensitive to our relations and our context and to difference, then extinction sort of will spread with its own sort of machinic dynamic, that it's not really an individual responsibility. I think that would have to be the key to both thinking about fitness and about thinking about extinction, that it's about a relational set of things, not about inherent attributes of entities. That's what I sort of think we sort of get from an islandy relational understanding, that you might be really fit like the human, is like really big and clever and all the rest of it, but you know, if you let the bees die off or whatever, and then the flowers don't pollinate and all the, you know, the consequences are extinction, even though you thought you were being fit. It's like because you didn't understand what being fit meant. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor David. Professor Jonathan, you want to add? Okay. Please enable Professor Jonathan. Okay.
Yeah. So that was a really nice question, that last one. So what I could take from that is, perhaps you could also say, is resilience kind of been critiqued now? And are the islands as correlational machines for extinction going to become more and more important? That could be something that you could draw out from that question as well. And whilst this isn't a normative book, I think that's really important to say, our project isn't normative. In our other work, we have done things like critique resilience and things. In this book, we're setting up the problematic of islands as how we think through relational entanglements. And it may be the case, and we've done a lot of these things over the last couple of years, these discussions, that resilience is on the way as a mode of thinking, that it really has been criticized a lot. And increasingly in these talks in different parts of the world, you definitely see that. So it might be that we are, even as that's taking place, correlational epistemology hasn't been critiqued as much. And that would be interesting for further discussion. But yeah, thanks very much for that question.
All right. Thank you again, Professor Jonathan Pugh and Professor David Chandler, for gracing our 2021 PISO conference. Your insights, research results that you've shared to us will indeed enrich the possibility of contributing and developing the scholarship regarding the Anthropocene here in the Philippines. Okay, dear audience, I would like now to invite you to go back to room 1 for our General Assembly. Thank you very much again, Professors Jonathan and David. See you. Team, can you please send a chat in the chat box the link for room 1 for our General Assembly and election results. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Let's transfer to room 1, and I'll be ending this Zoom room po. Thank you so much. The room link is in the chat box po.